Gladys Meyer, now Gladys Brauer, grew up in rural Iowa near Bradford, attended country school, and then graduated from Iowa Falls High School. This story is about a girl, a child of the 20s, and a teenager of the 30s. What year were you born?
March 12th, 1920.
And how about your family growing up?
My family growing up, my dad's name was Herman, so Herman and Emma Kappen, her name was Kappen Meyer, and grew up in Lee Township, Franklin County, on a farm.
That's so Franklin County would be over by Bradford?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
And then brothers, sisters?
A brother, Casper, and a sister, Caroline.
And then what did your parents do?
My parents were farmers. Yeah.
Do you remember how many acres they farmed?
I think they farmed 160, if I remember correctly.
And that was a pretty big farm back then.
That was. Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, when you were you born at home?
Yes, I was.
And what was that like?
Well,
as far as when children were born back then?
I remember them saying that my neighbor lady came down to Mrs. Kelder house and when I was born, and the doctor came out, and I was delivered at home.
Were most children born at home back then in the 1920s?
All of them.
They were all born at home. When was your first time you remember being in a hospital?
I guess it was after I don't think I was in the hospital till after I got married.
Okay. And you had
had
your children then. And your children were born in a hospital?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Were your sisters and brothers, they were born at home too?
They were born at home because my sister was 11 years older than I was and my brother 13 years older. So.
Okay. Now on the farm life, you said your folks were farmers. What type of crops or what were your chores back then?
Well, we grew corn and oats and pigs and chickens and ducks and geese, I remember.
So back then, farming was pretty much you just sustain your life, but you had, let's say, multi animals instead of like now they do just hogs, but you would grow with or farm with many animals.
Yeah, we had a little bit of everything because we grew our own vegetables and butchered hogs and cattle and canned, and my mother even had crock jars and they filled that with meat and covered it with grease and it kept. Now you couldn't do that today. They wouldn't think of leaving that open. And then she canned some too.
Farm with horses then, what was that like? Or what do you remember most about that?
Well, I remember helping sometime, like when I was a little bigger, making hay and things, and I drove the horses, you know, and my brother kind of sat back on the on the hay rack when we loaded it with the what do I want to say, side deliverer, you know.
Now, when you did your horses, you didn't have tractors back then?
No. We did later, but not when I was growing up.
Were you still at home when, let's say, tractors came in?
I think so. Yeah, it was before. I don't know if it was when I was in high school or not. I don't think so.
So you basically grew up the farm, and your dad then farmed with horses.
Mm-hmm.
How many horses were in a team?
All I remember is two.
Two.
Yeah.
And do you remember how many hours or your dad would work a day?
Depending on the time of the year, they worked pretty long hours, you know, especially if it was picking corn or, you know, I don't really remember, but I would say it would be longer than 8 hours.
Now, did you get in the fields when you picked corn by hand?
No, I didn't, but my mother did. My mother helped my dad pick corn. I remember that because us kids had to stay home, you know, and they were gone. So my mother helped my dad all the time pick corn.
What were some of your other chores?
I had picked cobs up in the cob lot, in the hog lot, for the cook stove, and then I had to go in the grove and break up dry sticks so that they could start the stove. And then I remember we had a lot of cobs, and so my mother paid me a penny a bushel to put them in this shed.
And then when you say that you picked cobs up in the hog yard, you would give the corn to the hogs, they would eat the corn off,
Yes,
and then you would go out and pick the cobs up.
right.
Did you ever get scared by going in the hog lot picking up cobs?
I don't remember getting scared, but I know it was a messy job sometimes.
And then you would cook with the cobs.
Yes, cobs and wood, you know, and the sticks Mother always used to start the stove, you know.
What was that like, cooking in a cast iron stove with just cobs?
Well, it seemed like it worked pretty good. We had a reservoir on it that heated the water, and then we had a place up on top that kept the food warm, and a big oven. So
your kitchen, did you have an ice box?
no, we never.
No refrigerator.
No refrigerator. We either kept it down the basement or out in a tank.
What do you mean by out in the tank?
Well, you know, where they watered where the cattle came to drink, and the windmill always pumped the water, and that was cold water all the time. So, but most of the time we kept our things in the basement.
And what type of things did you keep as far as for food? As far as you could put down in the basement or in the tank?
Well, like our milk and butter, and we churned our own butter.
Okay. Now, when you heated your house, what did you use?
We had a kitchen stove in the kitchen, and then a pot-bellied stove in the dining room, and that's all the heat we had. You'd sit behind the stove to keep warm.
How about at nights? Would the folks get up and reload the stove to keep you warm?
I don't remember them doing that, but I remember we had these flat irons that we put on the kitchen stove, because we didn't have electric flat irons back there. We had regular old cast iron.
What about electricity in your farmhouse?
First I remember was just lamps. And then later on, wasn't too many years, I wasn't too old, and my dad got the first Delco plant. That was kind of an electric plant that run by a motor down in the basement, and it supplied us with electricity.
Before you had the electricity in the house, I mean, what would an evening be like, sitting by the lamps?
Yeah, wasn't too bright. We never stayed up very late. We usually went to bed pretty early. So I don't remember doing too much during, in the evenings, reading or anything.
How about in your house, your indoor plumbing? Did you have plumbing?
No, we had no plumbing, we had no running water. So we had to go outside to the outhouse when we had to use the bathroom, and we had catalogs for toilet paper, which was pretty rough. At night, though, we had what we called a commode, and if we had to get up in the night, we could use that, but then we had to empty it in the morning. We didn't go outside during the night.
Now, if you didn't have running water in the house, what about bathing?
Well, we had a big tub that we'd put in the kitchen, and of course we had to heat our water. We didn't have an electric heater. We had to heat our water on the stove or use it out of the reservoir. And then we'd take a bath, usually in the kitchen. But it was good if we did that once a week. And then we used the same water lots of times. Not everybody had their own water.
So in the winter times, if you wanted to take a hot bath, you had to go out, bring the water in, heat it up,
Yes,
and then fill your tub up and take your bath.
right. Yeah, by the kitchen stove.
Do you remember, did you have telephones?
Yes, we had a telephone that hung on the wall, and everybody had a certain ring. One ring maybe for one neighbor, two rings for another, and then you could listen to everybody talk if you wanted to.
Yeah, I remember they had those party lines.
Yeah, that's
And
what we had.
when the phone rang, you picked it up, you might have 6 or 7 people on the same party line.
Yeah.
All right.
And I helped mother wash, because all we had was a machine where you pulled the handle back and forth to agitate it. And so that was one of my jobs when we put different clothes in to do that. And I had to help churn butter, because we had a churn. We made our own butter. And then the wringer on the wash machine was by hand. And so you had to, wring that.
Now, when you did your laundry, you would heat the water up and wash the laundry by hand, and then you'd hang it outside to dry.
Right. We had a wash machine, but it was one that you pushed with a handle back and forth. It worked back and forth, and it went around and around.
What about in the winter time, and your clothes to dry?
Well, then we put them mostly in the house if we could. We put lines up. I can remember lines in our dining room and living room, and then we'd hang our clothes in there, because it was, or if we did hang them outside, then we'd have to bring them in anyway, because they wouldn't get dry. They'd freeze partially dry, and then they'd have to bring them in. So I remember that.
All right. What about schooling?
Schooling?
Yes.
Well, I went to a country school for 8 years, and there we just had a pot-bellied stove, and we had outhouses, and had to go across the street or across the road to get water, carry that. And I always had to walk. We lived about a half a mile. I don't remember ever being taken to school. Had to walk. And I remember my mother would, in the wintertime, would make me a wool dress. I'd have to wear aprons over it to keep it clean, because I probably wear the dress for a week or two, but you change aprons. And then we had long underwear that we had to wear, and with stockings over that. And as I got older, I hated the long underwear, because your stockings would look all baggy, so I'd roll them up. But
So you'd walk to school a half a mile or so,
yeah,
and you had a country school, one-room country school.
one-room country school. About 10 children, probably. And my sister was my teacher for 2 years. She graduated from high school when she was 18, and you could teach back then when you were 18 and through high school.
So back in the 30s, if you had a high school education, then you could go and teach school.
Right.
Now, as a child, what were some of your favorite memories?
Oh, I had a little poodle when I was little, and that was one of my favorite things. And then I remember making a playhouse out in the grove. We'd take string and make divisions for rooms, and had orange crates or whatever we could find. And doing that, and then the neighbors would, neighbor kids would come down and play, and they had a pony, and I loved ponies, and I always wanted my dad to get me one, but I was disappointed I never did get one.
Now, when you got done with country school and you decided to go to high school, what do you remember about that? And where was your high school at?
Heights, Iowa Falls. And we lived about 6 miles out, and you had to find your own ride to high school. So the first 2 years I rode with Thelma Newton, who was my neighbor, and she drove, and then she graduated, so then my dad bought me that Model A, and I drove the second 2 years, and then her brother, Ronald Newton, rode with me. We didn't have buses or anything.
Started going to high school. That would have been in the mid-30s?
Yeah, because I graduated in 1937.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was it like going from a small country school to a high school?
It was scary. I was timid and bashful, and these town kids had all been together, you know. The majority of people were town kids, you know. So it was, I don't know. I don't have too good of recollections of my high school years, I guess. Didn't get into any of the activities because we lived out on the farm, and so.
And then when you got to school, is there something, your studies were like what?
Well, I remember algebra and history and geometry.
And were there school events that you said you would go to, or you said you didn't get involved in a lot of school activities?
No, not in high school. I didn't go out. My dad wouldn't let me drive at night.
So then where did you go to college at?
Ellsworth.
For 2 years?
2 years.
Okay.
Then I could teach. Then I got my first teaching job in the country.
Where was that at?
It was at Sunnyside. It was about 4 miles straight east of Bradford, towards Geneva. And it was a nice brick school, and I had it for